All right, to discuss, let's bring in former Treasury Assistant Secretary David Pearl. David, great to see you again. Look, what's your take on the RBA's decision today? Does this show that their rate cut at the last board meeting was the wrong decision?
Absolutely, Sharri. As you reported very well at the time, the decision the RBA board made in February was probably the worst one I've ever seen. It was an unjustified rate cut based on the RBA board's own criteria, as I said on your program at the time, and it wasn't urgent. If the RBA wanted to be more convinced that inflation was under control, they could have waited until the next quarterly inflation readout in May. So, frankly, the credibility of the RBA board was damaged in February, and that's why I didn't think there was any chance they would go anywhere near cutting the interest rate again today. They've got some credibility to make up.
Credibility to make up, tough words. Look, the fact that the rates cuts weren't even discussed today, do you think this leads to the case that there might have been some political interference from the Treasury Secretary? You worked closely with Stephen Kennedy. Do you think this is something that should be investigated?
It should be, although there are tight lips in central banking and Treasury circles, as you know. Let's go back to the cameras being in the room. To me, that was the absolute giveaway, and I know that you hit upon this too, Sharri. There are two scenarios with the cameras being in the room, which was unprecedented. I don't remember it happening recently.
No, it hasn't happened.
It's not what central banks do. There are two scenarios. One, Stephen Kennedy or Jim Chalmers pressured Michelle Bullock to go against her own institution's interests and let the cameras in, knowing that the rate cut was in the can. Or two, Michelle Bullock, under her own initiative, welcomed those cameras in without any political pressure. And frankly, I don't believe the latter. So I don't know whether there's ever going to be a smoking gun. We might have to wait for some post-election deep throats to start speaking up. But that decision stank. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't warranted. And if you look at the RBA board statement today, Sharri, they say we're on hold. Activity is picking up in the economy. The labour market is still tight with labour shortages in some parts of the economy, and productivity is flatlining. So even though wages are moderating, the cost pressure from wages is rising. On the other side of the equation, you've got the Trump uncertainty effect. I get that. But looking purely at the Australian economy, there's still not a compelling reason. And let's not forget that after the energy price supports are removed at the end of this year, our headline inflation rate will be above 3% for the 12 months beyond that. So I'll leave it at that. I think it wasn't a very good decision, but the Trump uncertainty is clearly weighing on their minds at the moment.
Well, yeah, Michelle Bullock did address that. Here's what she had to say about the tariffs.
The impact on inflation is less certain because, on the one hand, if supply dominates, so if the impact on tariffs on supply dominates, then you might see a rise in inflation. But it's also possible that trade diversion might end up with cheaper goods coming into Australia. So there's competing impacts there.
What do you think about the impact of the tariffs? I mean, there's the aluminium and steel tariffs. There could be further tariffs, although, as I reported last night, it looks like Australia might get an exemption.
The economic impact is really through China. If there's any uncoupling between the US and China, the two most significant economies in the global economy, Australia would be seriously affected. People forget that the US and China have interlocking economic interests. The US consumer has been the source of demand for Chinese goods, and the Chinese government or Chinese investors have lent money to the US government to fund its deficit. So if you uncouple, if you pull that apart, Australia would suffer enormously. Now, we're not close to that yet, but if the Liberation Day tariff announcement later this week results in escalating trade measures, then there'll be a supply shock for the world economy and for the Australian economy ultimately. And that will make things very difficult, because when there's a supply shock, just as like we saw with OPEC in the 70s, output and activity come back and prices go up. So not a good time.
All right. David Pearl, former Assistant Treasury Secretary, appreciate your time.